Alright guys, so the topic I'm looking to research for my paper this semester is on how suburbanization and segregation, how these historical developments impacted the Kansas City public schools. So before we move further, I need to address exactly what I mean by suburbanization and segregation. When we talk about suburbanization and segregation, we're not talking about them as two distinct topics, but rather they overlap and often act as catalysts to each other. This will be expanded on in my paper, and as well as talked about later on in this presentation, but that's important to keep in mind when going forward. The inspiration for this topic came from a New York Times article written in 1996 titled "Back to Segregation." In this article, we get to see the landscape of the United States after Brown v. Board of Education, and how these public schools in the U.S. have attempted to desegregate and overcome centuries of institutionalized racism. And obviously, that proved to be a difficult challenge. There's a sentence in the article that really sums up the essence of what I'm talking about and how it relates to Kansas City. It says, like most urban systems, the Kansas City, Missouri School District has lost white students to the suburbs in droves, which has made the task of achieving racial balance nearly impossible. It goes on to say, instead of busing black students to the suburbs, a federal district court ordered the state and district to spend almost $2 billion to lure in white students. These two sentences kind of aim to two different parts of my scope and of my thesis. What I'm wanting to do is explain the macro and micro causes of the battle Kansas City had to desegregate its public schools, why it was so difficult, why it took so long to happen, and ultimately why it failed. That's my focus. What's important to keep in mind is that Brown v. Board made the decision to declare separate but equal unconstitutional back in 1954. Kansas City approved their first desegregation plan in 1977, which ultimately allowed attorneys to file lawsuits against school districts. About a decade later, by 1984, Judge Russell Clark finds that school districts are still suffering from segregation prior to Brown v. Board of Education, which seems obvious. You can't just change racial sentiments in the racial landscape and feelings of the country with one Supreme Court decision. So that's ultimately why it was so hard to desegregate the public schools. Now, this Times article puts Kansas City almost as like the case study, a basket case, if you will, for this mess of a situation, even noting that some other cities decided not to move forward with their integration plan because of what happened in Kansas City. But ultimately, what started all this? And that's what I want to talk about in my paper. There's really two key developments that made Kansas City's attempt to desegregate very difficult. Those two key historical developments lie within suburbanizations / the expansion of the metro. I'll break this down into two phases later, but for right now, we can lump that together as one key distinct historical development. The other being a racial and socioeconomic divide that exists in Kansas City. Pretty defined, permanent, and still withstands today. I'm speaking on the Truce Divide in Kansas City, which basically separates the east side is the poor, low economic black side of Kansas City, while the west side of Troost and the neighborhoods west of Troost are seen as the more prosperous and wealthy neighborhoods, or the white side of town. Examining these two key historical developments and attributing them to the messy situation that happened when Kansas City tried to desegregate their schools. Just to kind of get a gist of what I mean by suburbanization, we can start with the modernization of transportation, whether that be public transportation like the trolley or more private transportation like ownership of a vehicle. That allowed individuals to move more to the peripherals of the city and not necessarily relying on the social network of an urban core for all their opportunities. So basically, since people are allowed to move and travel and to work to the urban core of the the city expanded. This brings into play J.C. Nichols, which we'll talk about later, and obviously more residents, more people, more neighborhoods is going to equal more schools. Although I divide suburbanization and expansion of the metro from racial and socioeconomic divide, we'll see that they go hand in hand, which is what I spoke on earlier. And ultimately, these two factors is what sets it up for what I just talked about Kansas City having such a hard time to desegregate. Now, let's get into these two different phases of suburbanization in Kansas City. First is just the expansion of the city itself. What I was mentioning about modern developments in transportation, J.C. Nichols, that is where I'm getting at right here. The Kansas City forming a country club district. We've had frequent readings in this class this semester over J.C. Nichols from Worley and his biography on J.C. Nichols. Basically, the essence of that is that the early phase was driven by transportation and the desire to move from the urban core. And J.C. Nichols capitalized on this. There was the story of him studying in Harvard, and he learned that the migration patterns of people tending to move southwest for economic development, and he predicted that in Kansas City as well, which led him to plan out the residential community of the country club district, the shopping center, and all those developments. From here, we see demographic shifts, driving the east and west truce divide even more. These correlations will be more structured and more identified in the paper. There's a lot to talk about right now, so I kind of wanted to give you guys the overall gist. Phase 2 of suburbanization, it really comes after World War II, and now we're not just talking about expansion of Kansas City itself from an urban core to its peripheral boundaries like the Country Club District, but rather from the city of Kansas City to other surrounding areas like Parkville, Liberty, Lee Summit, Blue Springs, Olathe, all those other towns that surround Kansas City become integrated into this metro. This isn't just happening in Kansas City. This is happening all over the United States, and Crabgrass Frontier does a great job at capturing this. Single-family homes went from about 114,000 of them in the United States in 1944 to 1,692,000 in 1950. And another key aspect about suburbanization in this era is that by 1950, the national suburban growth rate was about 10 times that of Central City. So suburbs are growing, cities not as much. In 1954, the Forbes editor estimated that 9 million people have moved to the suburbs in the previous decade. And we'll see how this sets the context for what happens in Kansas City, especially with Brown v. Board of Education and the attempt to desegregate. Now, it's contextualizing these effects and putting them into the context of Kansas City. We need to discuss the ramifications of the expansion. Once schools were forced to desegregate, and white students were forced to be in school with black students, families were disgusted and decided to move out to the metro to basically escape having to integrate into their schools and to go to school with students of other races. A central part of my paper is breaking the thesis into two parts, and the first being what we just discussed, attaching suburbanization and the expansion of the metro and these socioeconomic and racial divides of Kansas City to what happened when we attempted to integrate our schools. And the second half of the thesis is more of like the so what aspect. We need to look at the current state of Kansas City public schools. It has not been that great. They've not really been able to recover since this fight to integrate, and it's just been an ailment, a constant ailment since then. The lack of accreditation ultimately being the tipping point for why Kansas City became a failing district, but it's on the rise. Kansas City public schools are looking to be accredited within the next 2 years, as long as these APR scores stay up. So the question that it leads us to the question, is KCPS recovering after these centuries of hard segregation? My argument is no matter whether you think KCPS is recovering or not, is that the reasons why it has failed is attributed to suburbanization, the expansion of the metro, in the socio-economic and racial divides within Kansas City. Understanding how we got here is important to understanding how we're going to fix the future and create a better public school district for Kansas City's children. And that's the focus of my project. Thank you.